I'm a multidisciplinary nut and I have been for more than 20 odd years now. I've been teaching the subject for more than 2 decades. I got interested in it when I came across the famous talks by Charlie Munger on elementary worldly wisdom.
India's most profound value investing teacher. What are some of the lessons that you apply on a daily basis in your life?
Investing, there are two big lessons: how to make money and how to not lose money.
Deeply grounded in the public markets, then it's a very different
That's
conversation you have with the founders.
In the public market, for the most part, except during speculative bubbles, the public markets are always saying, "Show me the money, show me the real earnings, show me the owner earnings, show me the cash flow," and then we'll decide whether you are worth something or not. For the most part, there are exceptions, there are bubbles, there are pockets of bubbles, but that's not the case in venture cycles, right? So the scarcity of Ferrari can only be addressed by Ferrari. So that scarcity cannot be solved by anybody else. But the scarcity of an iron and steel can be solved by any iron and steel company. So it's all about who controls the scarcity. So all shortages are not the same.
Some of the companies that, when all the things are going wrong or there's a bad news cycle about a company, as a value investor, you would want that company to be the exception and, emerge out of this crisis and become more resilient. But how do you know that that company is going to be an exception and not the norm?
You don't know from advance. Investing is a game of probabilities.
At seed stage, I'm trying to find an undervalued opportunity which has the potential to become a multi-bagger, and you in your value investing world are also doing that.
You see, multi-bagger is a term which...
Hello and welcome everyone to the India Opportunity Show. Our guest today is one of India's most respected value investors, teachers and thinkers. I'm talking about Professor Sanjay Bakshi. Professor Bakshi has influenced an entire generation of investors across the world. He doesn't do interviews very often, so I'm so thrilled that he took the time out to sit with me today. We talk about not only about investment philosophy, but also spirituality, Stoic philosophy, as well as behavioral finance and psychology, and how you can integrate all of that into becoming a better investor. Actually, these are timeless principles, not just beneficial to investors, but also decision makers in boardrooms, founders, and operators. Hopefully, this conversation will inspire you in many different ways and potentially enrich your lives. Hope you enjoy watching. Hello, Professor Bakshi. Welcome to the India Opportunity Show. Thank you for doing this with me today.
Thank you, Srishti, for having me. It's a pleasure.
I know you don't do this very often, and this is your only second in-person interview, so I'm truly privileged and honored to.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure.
And we have many common friends, as we were just talking about. But Professor, I wanted to start with your multidisciplinary thinking and your lateral approach to things, because that's a common theme that your students recall having learned the most from your teachings. So can we talk about that, and can we start there, please?
Absolutely. I'm a multidisciplinary nut and I have been for, I think, more than 20 odd years now. I've been teaching the subject for more than 2 decades. I got interested in it when I came across the famous talks by Charlie Munger on elementary worldly wisdom. Many of the people in the audience would be familiar with those talks. And they just grabbed me, and I said that this is something that I can learn from and I can teach and I can apply in my own field of investing. And I have been doing this for now 21 years, and I just absolutely love it. I can give you some examples.
I'd love that.
So, there are all these disciplines that you can draw from. And as Munger once said, he said many times actually that, worldly wisdom is very academic. And we are taught all these wonderful things in school and college, but we forget how to apply them in the real world. And I remember we were taught stuff like elementary mathematics, probability, statistics, biology, and our teachers taught those subjects to us and those concepts to us, but we never applied them. And it's only after many decades that I realized that these things have very strong practical utility. So I started thinking about those things and started applying them and started teaching them over the years, and I found that these are like really good ideas and we can apply them. And that's the way I've always been thinking about in the last 21 years. So I'll give you some examples. If you remember, in school we were taught things like in statistics we are taught a concept called mean reversion.
Yeah.
You throw a coin, you toss a coin 10 times, and it's not uncommon to end up with 8 heads and 2 tails. But if you keep doing it, you're going to end up with 50% heads and 50% tails. So over a period of time, the number of heads to the total number of tosses will approach 50%. The 50% is the mean. It's a reversion to the mean. The 0.5 is the attractor. And that's all that we were taught. And that's about it. But it has got such deep implications in the world of business, in the world of investing. If you think about it, in the world of business, we have a business which is doing very well right now, but has no entry barriers. And it's only a matter of time when competition will come in. So the returns are going to be mean reverting. It's inevitable. So you have a combination of statistics and you have a combination of elementary economics. You have business cycles. You have a period of shortage where industry is doing very well right now, but then when you combine that with psychology, when people are making a lot of money in an industry, then they can't see other people get rich and they want to become rich themselves. They want to expand recklessly, and everybody is doing it. And then all shortages are followed by gluts eventually. So there are a whole lot of things in psychology which combine, along with the idea of mean reversion, that you're going to end up with returns going down over time, because when you have a glut, the price of the commodity is going to come down over time. But not all things are mean reverting. In financial markets, for example, stock prices are not mean reverting. Stock price of a great company will keep going up. But stock returns are mean reverting.
Yeah.
So you may have a bull market which is followed by a bear market, followed by a bull market, followed by a bear market.
Like what we are experiencing right now after the pandemic and seeing a massive...
We'll keep experiencing those cycles. We'll have good years and we'll have bad years, but at the end of the day, the underlying business's performance will be reflected in markets. Markets are a mirror, so to speak, and they would over time reflect what the underlying businesses are doing. Sometimes the businesses will outperform the market, sometimes the businesses will underperform the market.
Yeah.
But in the long run, the market will reflect what the businesses are doing. So, if the businesses are delivering a returns on capital of 15%, you can't have a period when the markets are giving you a return of 30% per annum. You will have period when the market will give you 30% per annum. Then you'll also have period when you will have minus 20, 25% per annum. And that's inevitable. That's a feature and not a bug. You're going to have those periods. So if the underlying returns on capital are going to be 12 or 13 or 14%, you can't expect the markets to give you 18% per annum. So that's the nature of mean reversion that we have to, sort of incorporate in our thinking. So that's the basic point I'm making here. This whole idea of mean reversion which is taught in school, how it sort of should be incorporated in our thinking in the world of business, in the world of investing. Now, if you think about the mean reversion, is just one idea. The opposite of that idea is something in physics, which is also taught in school, momentum. You're taught in momentum, how a ball that is put on the top of a hill and it's put down, it gathers momentum. And Buffett talks about the concept of a snowball. And we've seen that a great business, if it gathers momentum, can become better and better over time. So we have this concept of fundamental momentum. Businesses which you call as compounders, businesses that are going to get bigger and better over time. And the interesting thing in business analysis is that you have both these different methods, both these different ideas. You have mean reversion and you have momentum. But the frameworks are different. And people, if they go wrong in using the frameworks meant for fundamental momentum and they apply them to mean reversion or vice versa, they're going to go wrong. So it's important to understand what kind of business you are looking at. Is it a cyclical business? Is it a compounding business? And then apply the right kind of framework.
Can you give us some examples in terms of how to apply it to different business models?
Absolutely. If you are investing in a cyclical company which has low entry barriers and there's a period of shortage that is going through, obviously you're going to see a period of boom. You're going to see a jump in earnings. But it's only a matter of time when new capacity is going to come. And there is the shortage is not going to last. Shortage is not, it's not in your control.
Yeah.
But if you are running a company called a Ferrari, which is a company which makes only 13,000 cars a year. And if you look at the stock price of Ferrari, it's done way better than a company called Toyota, for example, which makes more cars in a day than Ferrari makes in a year.
Yeah.
And if the stock price returns of Toyota are just about 4 or 5% a year, whereas that of Ferrari is about more than 25% a year. And the reason for that is Ferraris understand scarcity. People who want to buy a Ferrari car, they can't get it anywhere. They can only get it from Ferrari. So the scarcity of Ferrari can only be addressed by Ferrari. So that scarcity cannot be solved by anybody else. But the scarcity of an iron and steel can be solved by any iron and steel company. So it's all about who controls the scarcity. So all shortages are not the same.
Yeah.
Now here is the interesting thing. If you look at diamonds, diamonds are a girl's best friend. If you remember the tagline.
Yeah.
And there's a company behind that, DBS. DBS was a wonderful company which did very well because they could control the scarcity or the supply of diamonds. But look what happened. Now we have lab-grown diamonds. They've come. So their control on the scarcity or the supply of diamonds is no longer as strong as it used to be. And we've seen what happened to that. So it's all about understanding the nature of the business. All scarcities are not the same. So if you may have a business that may be doing very well right now, but if the underlying assumptions which are causing that business to do very well right now will change, then everything changes.
That's so true. And, thank you for sharing these real world applications of things that we learned in school, but never knew how to actually use them and practice them in real life. But coming back to the point, you're India's most profound value investing teacher. What are some of the lessons that you apply on a daily basis in your life?
Daily basis? Well, I learned a few things about investing. There are two big lessons. One is how to make money and how to not lose money. So I teach two courses basically. I teach a course on case studies and business and investment analysis, which is about how to make money. And if you're a venture capitalist, you will know a lot about that subject, and maybe you can tell me. You deal with a lot of entrepreneurs, and there are many ways of making money. And people who would have thought that this guy will never succeed ends up becoming a billionaire because there is so much uncertainty.
Yeah.
If you look at how people make money, there are dozens and dozens of ways of making money, and nobody knows what's going to work. There's so much uncertainty out there. But if you look at how people blow up, how to lose money, there are only a few ways in which you can blow up. So the other course that I teach is on behavioral, economics or, biases and how people screw up, essentially. So the one course is about how not to screw up, and the other course is about how to think about success and how businesses make money and so on and so forth. So I think if you look at it from the point of view of investing, one is how to think about the upside, how to get exposure to the upside. And there is a lot of uncertainty. You want exposure to positive black swans. And maybe you can tell me more about that because you come from that space, and maybe a lot of your followers and people who watch your podcast don't know this side of your life. You have,
as we discussed.
Yeah, as we discussed.
Wait, I think what you're referring to is the asymmetric upside that can happen in these potential venture bets, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So tell me how that works.
Well, similar to the concepts of value investing, like we were discussing, you try to find fair business, great quality businesses at fair prices. What we are looking at is pretty much market creation, right? Or entrepreneurs being able to tap into large underserved markets and go after really big opportunities. And in the venture ecosystem, you're looking for exponential multi-baggers.
Okay.
Because the power law is so true in the venture world, where you might invest in 10 companies, but you only really need one or two of them to be true outliers in that sense to make up for the entire portfolio. So in terms of venture capital portfolio construction, it looks very different. Like, when you're taking these bets, that out of the 10 bets, not many will fail. A few of them might just do about okay, and some of them will do exceptionally well, and so well that they will make up for the entire invested amount and also give you returns on top of that.
And I know you don't want to name the company, but you did tell me that you made 60x in one of the companies.
Yes.
So that paid for a lot of the mistakes, so-called, mistakes that might happen. And that's wonderful because that's what asymmetries are about, right? Because the maximum that you can lose in an equity investment if you have not borrowed any money is 100% of your money. If you buy a stock for $100, you can lose $100, but you can make $1,000, $10,000, maybe more. And that's the asymmetry in equities. And on the venture side, the asymmetries are larger. On the value investing side, it's maybe somewhat less. But in the end, it's the same game, right? I mean, we are in the same game, isn't it?
Absolutely. Finding great businesses, either at different stages, right? I would look at it at a pre-seed seed stage where, it's literally day zero of company formation, whereas you come in much later where there's actually a track record of execution and you're able to see some of the data points in terms of how the founders have executed.
Which is why I need people like you, because you're the ones who are going to feed me the companies which have proven and have become prosperous and are operating and have gone public, and then the market being crazy is valuing them for some reason, some stupid reason, at valuation which are like really dumb.
Yeah.
And then I would like to lap them up. But I get the point that there is a place for people like you who are helping these companies come to market, and many of them will fail, but the ones that do succeed will become available to people like me who are much more conservative, be able to buy those things at valuation that are compelling. But I think we are both value investors.
Yeah,
It's
although
just that-
one would argue that the prices that the new age companies are coming to the markets with are so richly valued that it takes a long time for those companies to actually be able to become return generators in one sense, because we mark up in the private space the valuation so much by the time the IPO or pre-IPO is about to happen that there's not much room left on the table for value investors such as yourself.
So you're actually confessing on camera about what
But that's the truth, right? And we've seen that play out. So this
Yeah.
is like, if people don't know this, then this is the obvious truth of venture capital, right?
But isn't it amazing that I've seen that a lot, in the venture market, every round of financing is done at a higher and higher valuation.
There are down rounds also and flat rounds,
There are,
as we call
but
them.
not as much. But you
You
never
don't hear about them. They're
but
quite high.
but in public markets there are never up financing. It's always down. Who would actually give money to a company when there's a public listing? I mean, there's a price out there in the marketplace and the company wants to raise more equity capital. Nobody will give it money at a price which is higher than the price at which the stock is already trading, right?
Yes.
So all financing must necessarily happen at a discount. So the life of a company post IPO is very different than the life of a company pre-IPO. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. Yes. I have seen this journey for some companies who, have gone from seed to late stage, growth stage, and then prepared for an IPO or are in the process of preparing for an IPO. And my whole concept to them is that, you better start acting like a publicly listed company already 2-3 years, even before you think of a listing, because, how the market perceives you is very different from how private market investors will throw money at you. And
Why do you think that happens?
because there's so much more accountability and financial discipline that comes in, and you also have to find out it's for these founders who are used to maybe thinking on yearly basis. Suddenly they are exposed to these short-term market cycles where there are quarterly earnings, there are there are analyst calls that they have to attend to. So you have to find that delicate balance of managing short-term with the long-term. And some founders struggle to comprehend what that scale and magnitude of that problem can be.
Could part of the reason be that you're marking to myths in the private markets?
That could be true too. Well, that is true. I would say, that's why, we need the public markets to rationalize. And, all said and done, I am trained in public markets, right? Like I started my learnings from there. All the gurus that we have, like Charlie Munger, etc., I've grown up on books like that. So imagine my disconnect when I come from public markets, but then have to attempt to apply some of these philosophies in the private space. So, there is a lot of contrarian thinking that you need to do. You cannot participate the same way that some of the VC funds would participate.
Yeah.
And how some of the other investors think, because they are thinking from a very different lens versus if you are deeply grounded in the public markets, then it's a very different conversation you have with the founders.
That's true. In the public market, for the most part, except during speculative bubbles, the public markets are always saying, show me the money, show me the real earnings, show me the owner earnings, show me the cash flow.
Yeah.
And then we'll decide whether you are worth something or not. For the most part, there are exceptions, there are bubbles, there are pockets of bubbles and all, and there is sometimes, a dot-com bubble kind of a situation. But that's not the case in venture cycles, right? Because there you get valuation based on metrics which has got nothing to do with cash flows.
Yeah. Sometimes they don't even make money, right?
In fact, making money is a sin, right?
Yes. In fact,
It's a different world altogether.
yeah, it's so contrarian to, what we see in the public markets because, when a company is going from pre-seed, seed to about Series A lot of investors will actually tell the founders that you can delay your monetization.
But
And that's a very common theme.
Tell me then, how can you blame the founders that, all their life they've been trained to behave in a certain manner. Suddenly they go public and they say, no, I have to behave in a completely different manner. No matter, they are so confused.
That is what I was referring to, that, it's a complete behavioral flip for even the founders and the management who's been a part of the business. Because what got you from 0 to 1 and then 1 to 10 is not going to take you from 10 to 100.
It's like driving your car at a very high speed and suddenly you have to turn around and, go in the other direction. You have to go towards cash flow generation. And of course, that absolutely changes the way you run the company.
But what I've also seen is that the best founders do have this gene of, being good capital and resource allocators, even at the earliest stages. And we discussed this briefly with, having financial discipline in the company, which is a complete non-negotiable, even at the earliest stages. So some founders are trained to think like that. They might have built businesses previously and have come to this business that they're building.
So tell me more about that. Who would those people be? I mean, I don't know very many of those ones because I see flashy offices and people having camellia apartments.
Yes, we discussed that as well. I think, a lot of venture capital money has actually just flown straight into golf links, as we were discussing. But what also happens is that there are disciplined founders who have the accountability to be able to at least update the numbers on a regular basis, right? And you actually, when you start working with the founders, you want them to have the operating discipline to be able to reflect in the numbers as well. So first conversations that you have with the founders after the investment are more about, how do you build financial discipline in the company and which are the operating metrics to even pay attention to. Because a lot of first time and second time founders sometimes don't even understand that for this business model, these are the metrics that I should be focusing on, or these are the levers for my business that will really move the needle to be able to get to my North Star. So just defining some of these things and building that discipline from the earliest stages, I think that is key. Some founders are already good at it before they come into this business, but some founders have to be trained. And the ones that are the most receptive to feedback and coaching, because as an investor, I'm not delusional to think that my role is more than being a coach, right? It's more so just being a coach to the founder, and then ultimately the execution lies with the founders. Some founders unfortunately start thinking that this investor is going to come and build my business for me, which is where the death spiral starts. Or you start listening too much to the other investors and the bigger fund managers who are only thinking about these up cycles and making you such that you're packaged well for the other investors to come in and do growth rounds. So I think there are all sorts of flavors in the market, and you just have to identify the good actors from the bad, and hopefully you bet on more good people than the bad actors.
So how do you evaluate the capital allocation skills in a venture space as opposed to the way for me it's easier because the business is already making money. I'm invested in companies which are already profitable, and the dollar that is being earned, I have to decide whether it should go in this project or it should go in dividend or it should go in buybacks, or it should go in cash and strengthen the balance sheet, or it should go in debt reduction. For you, your founders have to decide, should it go in product development, this experiment, that experiment, sales and marketing. There is so much going on, and they have to or should it go in plush offices. There are so many more choices that they have to make. How do you decide that they are good allocators of capital? How do you judge the allocation skills of a founder?
Well, I think that, even when we are investing, there is usually some track record of excellence. And that is what we are trying to get to. In an exceptional founder, even if they haven't spent too much time building this business, they must have done something in their past which could be a reflection of that. Have they built a large, sizable business outside of this company before? And, what was the feedback from the employers at that point, or even the team members that they ended up working with? And secondly, then, how good are they at just making some of these decisions, right? Like, how fancy is their office? At seed
Okay.
stage, how fancy should your office be? Or should you be in a rented premises for till you figure out, is there actual true love and adoption from the market, right? So just identifying these softer signals, I think it's very qualitative rather than quantitative, what we are used to seeing in public markets. There you have ROCs and, profitability, EBITDA, those kind of things. But in the private space, you have none of that. And some of these companies will not be profit making for a long time before you actually see them fructify into something. So, you just have to be okay with wrapping your head around that level of uncertainty and betting on some of the variables to go okay in the journey all along.
One of the struggles in capital allocation is to pull the plug on something that made sense earlier, but the world has changed because, COVID has come or the funding has stopped
Yeah.
or some shit has happened somewhere else in the world that was not envisaged earlier. And that's usually not the case in the world that I come from, because I'm already looking at, companies that are already well funded. They don't need access to outside capital markets. They're already well financed and probably debt free, and they don't need to be dependent on capital markets. But for the space that you come from, how would you, as they say, the character of a person is known only when he experiences or she experiences a period of massive adversity. So when that period comes, how, without you pulling the plug from that person, how would you expect that person, that founder, to do the right thing by shutting down some projects that should be shut down now? Because if you don't do it now, it will ruin the whole company. It's like, cancer surgery.
Yeah.
If you don't treat the patient now, if you don't do the surgery right now, the patient is going to die.
Yeah, I think there again, coming to the point where, I've seen all spectrums of founder. Like, there's a large spectrum and founders could fall anywhere, where, there might be business founders who are self-aware enough that, this business model is not going to work out. So 6 months before they end, before the runway runs out for them, they will start thinking about what else could they potentially do. And then they start attempting different business models or pivoting to some other opportunity. And some of them tend to be very upfront with the investors, right? That, this is not working out, so I need to try something else. Then there's a whole set of founders who will not disclose, what the trouble is. If there is co-founder conflict and some of the things you just can't know as an investor who's detached from the business, but founders who are spending every day will know better, right? So you are also unfortunately biased only to the information the founder is giving to you.
So you are like a detached coach.
Yeah.
You can only take the horse to the water. You cannot make him drink. Sort of
You
thing.
can give them the guidance along the way. You can show them that this is the water, whether they choose to drink it or not drink it or walk away or, do whatever they want with the water. That's on them, right? So ultimately, the onus does lie on the founders. But coming back to our conversation, and
by now, I think the audience was wondering if the podcast is getting done on Boo. Who's the interviewer here?
Please, I want to flip it back to you. But because, I fundamentally believe that high quality businesses have the same nature throughout, be it private markets or public markets. Let's talk about that.
Okay, done.
Finding high quality businesses at cheap prices. Because ultimately, that's what we're trying to do, right? Like at seed stage, I'm trying to find an undervalued opportunity which has the potential to become a multi-bagger. And you, in your value investing world, are also doing that.
You see, multi-bagger is a term which I don't really like very much. In your world, you need multi-baggers because your game is such. You're going to have a lot of businesses that go to zero. So you need multi-baggers. The place where I am more concerned about CAGR of the portfolio. Because, what matters is what the portfolio CAGR is going to be over a long period of time. That's what matters to me. In the long run, that's what matters to you also.
Absolutely.
But to get you a good CAGR, you necessarily need a lot of multi-baggers because a lot of them will will give you strong negative returns, maybe minus 100% returns. That's not the case in the spectrum of value investing that I come from. So for me, multi-baggers are not that important. I don't think the obsession with multi-baggers in the value investing style that I come from is that important as much as it is for people on your side of the value investing spectrum. As you can see that I'm counting you as a value investor. Because we all agree with three basic principles that underneath every stock or bond, there is a business. There's a business. That's principle number one. And principle number two is that markets can do crazy things. And the third is there is a margin of safety out there. And margin of safety can come from any source. For you, you're looking for asymmetric payouts. For me, it's coming from the quality of the business, the quality of the management, the moat which is already there in place. You're looking for a moat that will emerge over a period of time. You're betting on the person. You are betting on a founder. You have some track record. You believe in the person's capability or his past track record. I'm betting on the strength of the business model that is already in place, and then the founder, the track record of the founder. So the source of the margin of safety could come from many sources, but those three principles remain the same.
Yeah, they're absolutely the first principles of value investing. But are there any misconceptions that you've encountered that people have about value investing at large?
Oh yeah, absolutely. People have these buckets, they call it growth or they call it value. All investing is value investing. Consciously paying more for something than it is worth is not investing, is speculating. I think so. The whole idea of investing should be that am I getting more than what it is likely to be? Am I getting a value much more than what the price that I'm paying? Is the value that I'm going to get is likely to be much more? That's a very interesting question, because if you really study Ben Graham, he never put a value to a stock. He just said this is the minimum value. And the question, what is the stock worth, is very different from is the value likely to be much more than the price that I'm paying. So his objective was always towards seeking margin of safety, that the value is much more. No, I don't know how much it is, but it cannot be less than this. So the price I'm paying is 100. The value cannot be less than 150. It could be 200, it could be 250, it could be 300. I don't know, but it cannot be less than 200, and I'm paying 100. So there's a massive margin of safety. He never valued a stock. He basically said the minimum value has to be at least twice of what I'm paying for it. That's a source of margin of safety. So he never got into the DCF, which I think is exercise in delusional thinking. We were joking about Microsoft Excel being a fiction writing software. So the whole idea of getting into that kind of thinking of, explicitly laying out what the business will earn, especially in a world that we live in, which is changing so rapidly, trying to figure out what the world will earn. We don't know what the world is going to do after 2 years, let alone what the business will look like after 10 years. Yeah. So it's very, I think, difficult to visualize what a business may look like after 10 years. Yeah. So I don't think it makes sense to make those explicit forecasts. But that does not mean that you can't seek sources of margin of safety from there are other sources of seeking margin of safety. So the way you apply value investing is what matters, but at the end of the day, you're seeking confirmation that the price that you're paying is way less than the value that you're likely to receive.
Yeah, and I've heard you say that Charlie Munger has had a deep influence on your way of thinking. And I was reading this book called Tao of Charlie Munger, in which, they talk about how Ben Graham would exit a lot of the companies that, Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger decided to then hold for a very long time. So this goes back to the point that you were just making, that, Ben Graham had a price in terms of, where that margin of safety was. And then, he would also exit those companies because he did come from the Great Depression and he had the trauma that he lived through there. So he wouldn't hold the companies for very long. And then Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger came in and they completely not flipped that model. Their quality of businesses and identification was the same, but they just changed the time period that would go on in terms of holding those companies. So what are the principles that you've derived from these two different approaches at large?
So I've evolved, like everybody does, and I think you would have evolved too over the years that you've been an investor. We all do. My own evolution started as a Graham style investor, then Fisher style investor. Then I blended the two approaches. Basically, I want to be on the spectrum of quality, but I want to have the discipline of Graham when the prices that I want to pay, and it's the combination that I love. So what that means is that when I invest in a business, I want it to be a reasonably high quality business, which I believe has a competitive advantage. but the price that I want to pay is something that will make Ben Graham happy about what I paid for it, or at least not unhappy about what I paid for it. Uh, and that makes it rare. If you're not going to find very many of those combinations, because a great business, if it is recognized, will be price high. So it will not be Graham will not be happy if I bought it. So what that means is that, but naturally, you're going to end up with a more concentrated portfolio. Graham, on the other hand, was buying statistical bargains, and he would hold them for short periods of time. They were no longer cheap. He would flip them. So that would require 40, 50, 70, 80, stock portfolio.
Yeah.
So you move it from some 70 stock portfolio to a 15 stock or a 10 stock portfolio. Naturally, your holding periods are going to be much longer than they would be on a Graham sort of a framework. So that has definitely happened with me. But the blending of these two approaches has really helped me evolve as an investor. So I absolutely love that.
And talk about that a little bit more in your personal investing journey. Like, are there any companies or examples that you want to highlight?
You have to come to my course for that. I don't want to get into trouble with SEBI because they say you're talking about this stock, in a public place.
It just helps them become more real in the audience's mind. You don't, without taking names, if you could just name some sectors or, broader themes that you've looked at or held on to.
Sure. So about 4 years ago, I backed up the truck in a number of carefully selected government-owned companies. And again, not because I loved government-owned companies as such, but because I thought there was a strong prejudice against them. These are monopolies with very strong balance sheets, doing extraordinarily well, but were selling at really crazily low valuations, and selling at 4 or 5 times earnings, or dividend yields of 6%, 7%. And they had strong order books going into more than 10 years, debt-free balance sheets, returns on capital of more than 30, 35, 40%, in some cases even more than that. And if you remove the names of the companies, and I would do that with a student, they would think that these companies are run by some very strong entrepreneur with skin in the game. But if you actually put the name of the company there, they would say, my God, this is an untouchable because it's a government-owned company. These companies are untouchable. Value investors inherently love a space that is untouchable. Again, untouchable for the wrong reason. So for whatever reasons, PSUs were considered to be untouchables, and there's a logic behind that. For the most part, government-owned companies were not run for the interest of the minority shareholders, and I get that. But if you look at the whole picture, there are many privately run companies also which are not run in the interest of the minority shareholders, and you will know that. You come from the venture side, you have seen how governance is a huge risk that you have to worry about. So I think that's a single most important risk, apart from the business risk, about how the business could go down. The other big risk that you have to worry about is governance, right?
Yeah.
And that risk is there even in public markets, in businesses that are not owned by the controlled by the government. That risk is always there. It's the promoter risk, whether the promoter is the president of India or the promoter is some family. The risk is still there.
Yeah.
But just because the company is controlled by the president of India, it becomes an untouchable. That to me was a unjustified prejudice, given the nature of the business, given the track record of the company's earnings trajectory, and where I thought it was going in the next many years, and the valuation that I was getting. So that worked out extraordinarily well over the years. Today, I see the same thing happening in fossil fuels. That's a space which is deeply out of favor around the world in two big dimensions. If you look at by the way, I feel very strongly that the world cannot wean off fossil fuels anytime soon.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. If economic growth requires fossil fuels, any kind of analysis, logical analysis, in India specifically, you can't do without fossil fuel. Yeah, it's politically correct to say that we should wean off oil and gas and coal and petrol and diesel. But, these things can't be replaced.
That's a very controversial statement.
It may be, but
Because, we are all betting on renewable solar.
we need those
hybrid
things.
nuclear.
But those things cannot replace fossil fuels. Their share, the renewable share in the energy basket will grow, but the actual amount of energy that fossil fuels will contribute will keep growing, and that's what will produce the earnings.
Okay, dive a little deeper on that.
So the amount of coal that country needs will grow. The amount of oil the country needs will grow. The amount of gas the country needs will grow. That will keep growing over time, and that's what produces earnings.
Okay.
And if you look at the numbers, if you look at that space, it's bombed out in markets.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of prejudice so nobody's building oil refineries. People are getting out of coal all over the world. So in the industry itself is out of favor. The whole countries are getting out of that. So nobody wants to go in that space and untouchable. That's one part of it, which I love because competition is going down. And then if you look at this whole ESG thing in the investment space, nobody wants to touch these things. So there's a prejudice in the markets. People don't want to buy those stocks of those things or the bonds of those things. And of course, those prejudices produce wonderful prices.
Yeah.
So that's what value investors look for. So, you can't, if you get those businesses at 5 times earnings, 6-7% dividend yield, debt-free balance sheet, 50% ROEs, and growth, you can't keep these things down forever.
Yeah, I think this is the perfect example of what you often talk about, noise to signal ratio, because you do have to ignore all the noise here and pay attention to some of these signals where, it only comes from very on-ground research and independent thinking, right?
You have to let the numbers make the narrative. There's a narrative about Greta Thunberg and all these lovely characters.
Yeah.
And what they mean, and what the world should do about it, and what India will talk, and in all these world forums and all that about
zero carbon.
Yeah, all those. That's the narrative. But if you look at the actual ground reality, you can't do without fossil fuels. You need them. You can't. India needs more energy, and we need to burn more coal to get the energy. You look at around the world. We need more thermal power plants. We need more coal. We need more oil.
Nuclear could be a good.
We need that, but would you want to have a nuclear power plant next to your house?
No.
The NIMBY.
Yeah.
Not in my backyard.
You
don't want it.
Figure out storage of it, and
it's very hard. It's hard. It's a wonderful solution, but it's not easy to implement. Right. It's not easy to implement. And wind and solar are great solutions, but they have their own problem, and they are intermittent. They are not permanent solutions. So they're not going to solve the problem. And if you have economic growth coming in, and we are going to become the world's third largest economy, we can't have economic growth without more energy requirement. And if you study whatever is happening in the AI space, every time you go on ChatGPT, you are burning more trees. You're cutting down more trees. Sorry, not burning more trees. You're cutting down more trees because it is extremely energy intensive.
Yeah.
The amount of energy that is required to use AI
clusters absorb
enormous amounts. You just do some research on this space. How much energy AI requires, and AI its exponential energy requirement is going to happen, and that energy is going to come from where?
Do you think fossil fuels will be able to meet that?
There's no choice. We don't have a choice. It's not like I love fossil fuels. I love the idea of pollution. I don't. I live in the most polluted city in the world. It is. One of the things we were talking about, Stoic philosophy, confront reality. It is what it is.
Yeah.
You can't ignore the facts. You can either have economic growth, or you can have no economic growth, and then you can have all your green energy. You cannot have both. You need to have fossil fuels to drive economic growth.
And so, building on that theme, what are some other narratives that we all believe, but according to you, are misplaced or not?
There are all kinds of stories. People fall for these stories. So I had this wonderful concept called Bayes' rule. It was Thomas Bayes, I think 1760s or something. He wrote this Bayes' rule. Wonderful thing. Basically, this Bayes' rule taught us about how do you form views about anything in the world. And then how do you change views when new information comes?
So, Professor, building on that theme of seeing market bubbles, I think we've seen a lot of those in the recent times. Which of those do you think are flawed, in your opinion?
Let me just step back from this. We talk about narrative bubbles. Let me talk about narratives as such. We have this concept called the narrative fallacy. It was coined by, I think, Nassim Taleb. People fall for these story stocks, and there's an element of truth over there. But let me even go even further back to, I think, 1763. Thomas Bayes, he looked at it more formally. He came up with a theorem called Bayes' rule. We studied that in school. It was such a boring thing to study in school, but it's got such practical utility. And, he basically taught us how to form views about a subject matter, and how to revise that view based on new information that comes in. And let me give a couple of examples. So basically there are two components that he used. One is how to form an initial view about something, which comes from what we call as base rates, which is basically some information which is similar to what you're examining. So let me take an example. Let's say you're trying to evaluate the possibility of funding a startup in the restaurant business. You are a venture capitalist. You would know. So you would think about what is the mortality rate of restaurants.
9 out of 10.
9 out of 10. So 90%. So you say it's a very tough business to be in. Most restaurants don't last more than 3 years. That kind of a thing. That kind of understanding you already have. So it's a very, very tough business to be in. So that's the information that you already have. That's the base rate. Then you have to combine that with information specific to the situation that you're looking at. Now, it could be the chef. It could be the menu. It could be the location. It could be the track record of the person who has already set up many other restaurants, and he comes to you that I want funding. So any information that is specific to that particular person, if you're focusing only on that one person and his track record, then you're only focusing on information specific to that person, that story. If you only look at the narrative of that person, then you're missing out on the base rate. So people make one or the two mistakes. If they don't look at the base rates, they are being insensitive to base rates. And that's a very common mistake that people make. They go for stories. They're saying, oh, this is going to be the next Infosys. This is going to be the next HDFC Bank. You're not realizing the next HDFC Bank is usually HDFC Bank. Yeah. And they fall for these stories. And obviously there is something, completely wrong over there, So that's the correct critique of stories. People fall for these fads and fashions, and they don't realize that they are moving into something which is very dangerous. For example, they may blindly go and invest in a company which is into perfumes without thinking about how difficult it is to make money in perfumes. Most perfume brands don't make any money.
Yeah.
Or they go into the airline industry or the movie making industry or any other glamorous industry which with the success rates are very, very small. So that means you're insensitive to base rates. So that's one error that people make. The other error people make is oversensitive to base rates, which means that they pay too much attention to base rates and they ignore the information specific to that situation. And this is the example that I was giving earlier. Oh, it's a PSU. This is stereotyping. I'm not going to look at you. PSUs don't make sense. That's stereotyping. It's base rate. Oh, it's a PSU. I'm not going to. Oh, it's a Hyderabad company. So it's a fraud company, or or it's a commodity business. Not realizing that within a commodity industry there could be a niche that is emerging, or this is an M&A aggregator sort of a play, and M&As don't make sense. It's true that they don't make sense. Most aggregating companies, it's a tough game, but there are some people who have an amazing track record in that space. Constellation Software. There are so many. There are exceptions. So the idea is that if you can find an exception which is being treated like the norm, then you're onto something. So that's exactly the point. And so when we were looking at PSUs 5 years ago, there were hundreds of them. We only selected 5 because we thought they were unique. There was something different about them. They should not be it's like throwing out the baby with the bathwater, or to use the other metaphor, to paint everything with the same brush. So when investors do that, and this is exactly what I love about markets, because they have this prejudice. Value investing in that sense is exploiting prejudices of Mr. Market. Mr. Market is very prejudiced in the short term. Over time, when the numbers speak, when the numbers perform, the markets will overcome those prejudices. So in that sense, the market is also a Bayesian. The market, when the re-rating happens, market will reluctantly re-rate the stock. That means the market is acting like a Bayesian. Market is correcting past mistakes. But that gap between the time that it takes to re-rate the stock is the opportunity that the value investor has, because he has seen in advance that there is an opportunity there. The market is mispricing it. There's misunderstanding. So that's the situation. So for me, there's always a narrative, there's always a story, but I think you should always pay attention to the numbers, to the evidence. Let the narrative come out of the evidence and not the other way around.
How do you train your mind to do that?
Well, I'm an accountant, so it takes a bit of training. Not get carried away. I have made the mistake of getting misled by the charisma of some founders. So I think you have to deal with it much more than I do, because I don't meet founders anymore as I used to. You necessarily have to do that. So you have to tell me about how you deal with the halo effect of the founders, and I'm sure you would have also gone wrong in some cases. So maybe you can give me a few examples about.
Well, in the private markets, unfortunately, not too many examples there, because, you are betting on the jockey, right? You are betting on the founder's ability to be able to navigate all kinds of highs and lows. But then you just have to get to, how good the execution is, and then focus on the execution, barring before our investment. Yes, we might talk about the founder story, etc., but then post investment, it's all about execution.
But how do you explain the founder story of Elizabeth Holmes?
Yeah. Well, see,
What a story. And look who all backed her.
But interestingly, they were not VC investors, right? They were not your usual VC investors. They were
so you're trying to protect the VC industry?
Not at all. But it was a bunch of people who were investing outside of their circle of competence and weren't really privy to what was happening in the sector at large. So these were independent, ultra high net worth individuals that she could build a relationship with, and she onboarded as investors. But their usual job was to not have invested in businesses like this.
Wow. But I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned by studying people like her, or Ketan Parekh, or Harshit Mehta, or Bernie Madoff. These are extraordinary individuals with, they can sell anything.
What are your learnings being?
Stay away from them. When you encounter them, they have this ability, and I've encountered a few of them in my life, and I have also.
What are the telling signs or red flags that
you come back with an impression of falling in love with them when you meet them? And one thing which I've learned is put a sort of gap between the action and the impression that you don't act on your initial impressions. Give a long gap between the meeting and what you want to decide. And then for now, I'm almost 60 years now. I don't meet these people anymore. I'll rather read the transcript of a conference call and look at the data and look at the numbers and let the numbers do the talking instead of the people doing the talking. Because, when you meet these people, obviously you're going to hear the best things.
Yeah.
And you meet the IR team, they're going to tell you all the good stuff. So you have to insulate yourself from all of this. So
I think one way to also think about it is that, even when we are excited about investing in a potential company, we always give ourselves 24 hours more to think over it again. I think, that same thing.
Is that enough?
24 hours usually to get the excitement out of the equation, right? Like, it helps you at least get detached from that initial excitement where you're like, okay, now this is a great opportunity, let's go invest. But you have to think over it.
But then don't they use that against you, that, they're playing one against the other, that,
Well, then we don't want to be in those kind of deals, which are creating FOMO. And we saw so much bad behavior during COVID time where, founders were literally getting on Zoom calls with us and we're like, you have 24 hours to decide or 48 hours to decide. And we were like, okay, no, thank you. We are going to sit out of this. And, that served us well because there were so many misallocation decisions that investors took.
So you know all the psychological games. So you read all the Cialdini.
Yeah, well, you have to be detached from this process, right? And that comes back to Stoic philosophy in such a big way. And that is why I practice it. And I have this tattoo on my hand.
What is the tattoo?
It's Amor Fati.
I can't see it. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, you see the good, bad, and ugly, and the concept of radical acceptance, that, just accepting things as they are and not how you want them to be, or, things like that, because often investors just delude themselves.
That's true.
Yeah.
That is so true.
Yeah. So, but coming back to some of these red flags that you were talking about, cutting out the noise to signal ratio and things like that, how do you inculcate that over a period of time?
Oh, that will lead me to the lessons from spirituality. I think. I think it's important to recognize that there is so much wisdom in our whole spiritual text, and if you really get down to it, when I teach the subject, I feel that I'm basically looking at an old wine in a new bottle. There's so if you look at concepts like attachment and detachment. We'll call that endowment effect. We call it commitment bias. We given it new names. We have concepts called loss aversion. In and somebody got a Nobel Prize for that. Well, in in spirituality, we have concepts called equanimity. They treat losses and gains as if they were the same. That's the antidote for loss aversion. So the whole list out there. And Arjun tells you, Arjun is told by Krishna to be detached, to focus on the process and not the outcome. And Sachin Tendulkar will tell you that he looks at the playing field and not the scoreboard.
Yeah.
So we learn that, but I think it's important to incorporate these wonderful ideas in the way we think about the world of business and investing. And we live in a world, Shrishti, where the signal to noise ratio is getting worse and worse and worse. There's so much cacophony, and I teach students, Gen Z students, where their attention spans are that of a goldfish. They can't read a document beyond 2 pages.
Social media has made it worse.
Yeah, Instagram, the dopamine, all that. So it's important for us to teach them about the importance of concentration. There are some wonderful ways of learning that. Meditation is one, and I know you told me that you meditate every day. But meditation is not important just to be more spiritual. It trains you how to focus on something that is important, how to hold your focus on one object. It could be a flame, it could be your breath, it could be your thoughts. And that's so important because there in investing, in fundamental investing, the number of things that truly matter are very few, and they're not going to change.
Yeah.
But the number of things around that, the noise around that is going to keep growing and growing, and the cacophony is going to drown it all out. So you have to really know what not to read and what to not focus on. And it's so difficult to do that. There's a wonderful talk by Swami Sarvpriyananda about the I don't know if you've seen that video about the mind of a yogi. Have you seen that?
No.
So he gives the example of a mind of a yogi versus the mind of a worldly person. He's sitting by the river. He compares the river in winters and compare the rivers in summer. In the summer, the river is flowing very fast. That's the mind of a worldly person. Lots of thoughts.
Yeah.
Muddy thoughts and dangerous. And in the winters, the water is slow because it's frozen. Very few thoughts, slow thoughts, deliberate thoughts, and clean water. So he says the mind of a worldly person is very muddy. It's very fast moving.
Yeah.
And is very dangerous. And I think we should learn from the spiritual world about the power of slowing down our thought processes by moving away from this crazy world of Twitter and Instagram and moving your thumb all the time to see this reel and the next reel and the next reel.
Yeah.
We are not programmed to know everything about what is happening in every part of the world. We're not supposed to know all this.
Yeah.
We get agitated. Our minds get agitated by what is happening. Some shit is happening in some part of the world. and we get unnecessarily agitated about it.
Yeah, I think, Instagram and, I worked at Meta, so I have seen some of the things that happen in terms of how it affects people across the world, especially teenagers and younger audience, where, also they are not able to fully comprehend and detach themselves that, all the wars, war-like situations and all the, mishaps have always happened across history, right? But now, because we are in this Instagram and we are on Instagram and social platforms like this, it's all aggravated into becoming a collective, a collective mourning of sorts. Where if you aren't posting about the India-Pakistan war on your timeline, are you not seen? Are you being? Can your patriotism be questioned in one sense, right? So then you live in this echo chamber where you're going on repeating what your collective, what your friends and followers are posting about, because everyone is like collectively mourning or grieving some of these situations. But it's not like these things haven't happened before. It's just constantly being bombarded with this hasn't happened before.
Yeah, to be sure, I think the India-Pakistan situation is different here. We've just gone through a period of major, stress, and every Indian would be concerned about what the country has gone through.
Yeah.
But I don't think we should worry so much about Russia and Ukraine and what's happening in other parts of the world. I don't think that's any of our business. But what's happening to India and Pakistan, it is very much our business, I think. You do need to. But beyond a point.
How people start posting about it, like
Yeah.
it's going to impact something which will happen. You don't necessarily need to keep posting about it daily, right?
That is true.
That's what I was referring to.
That is true. Guilty as charged. In my college group, I've been doing that. In school group, I've been doing that. So
It does create a collective sense of, shared grief or like negativity in that sense, where, of course, these things are very important. And don't get me wrong, I completely agree with that. But, it's more about, what kind of impression it leaves on the other people who are receiving that message and what it triggers in them.
That is true. That is so true.
Yeah. But coming back to, the meditation side of things, how has meditation made you a better investor?
Well, the most important thing it does is slows you down. It slows everything. Again, if you go back to, the modern lingo, Danny Kahneman called it system 1 and system 2 thinking.
Yeah.
System 2 is more deliberate thinking. System 1 is automatic. And meditation makes you be more reflective. It slows you down. It doesn't make you jump to conclusions. And in the world that we live in, which is a fast moving world, there is this propensity to react and to overreact, and it can be devastating to portfolios. People just jump to conclusions, and in a world that we live in right now where we have these deep fakes, it's so easy to get misled. You don't even know, is it true, did it really happen? So people jump to conclusions which could be completely wrong without even thinking too much about it. And then there is this other aspect about the market being pari-mutual, which I love talking about in my classroom. You go to a casino and you put your money on a roulette table, then no matter what the other players are doing, the odds of you winning or losing do not change. The behavior of other players do not change your odds of winning or losing. That is not how the real world works. The real world of business and investing, the behavior of other people changes the odds. If you are a strong player in an industry and other dumb players are there and they behave in an aggressive manner and the cycle turns down, they will go out of business. And you haven't done anything wrong. You become strong on your own just by being in the right place at the right time and not doing stupid things, by not participating in the dumb behavior of other people. Because you are in a pari-mutual system, the dumb behavior of your competitors makes you stronger. Doesn't happen in a casino, happens in the world of business. In the world of markets, it happens all the time. Bad news can transform a stock into a great investment opportunity. And in a sector where a low-cost operator, stocks gets thrown out of the window because the whole sector is thrown out. But some of the players are going to go out of business because they were highly levered companies, or they were high-cost operations, or they had a fixed cost structure. I mean, the usual suspects. Many of those companies will go out of business. When the dust settles, this one company will survive and thrive and come back. And in the meantime, the stock has gone down. So it's a better business today and a more attractive business today. It's a great news. So, the stock, so while the overall news is bad, but the opportunity is even more attractive now than before. So, but people don't think like that. They don't think of the second order effect or the third order effects.
Yeah.
So they just jump to conclusions. They think, oh my God, there's a war happening, or there's COVID coming, or there's some development. They just run for the exits. And I think that propensity to be trigger happy goes away when you become more reflective, when you slow down your thinking, when you become more meditative. It automatically happens. It's an outshoot of just being maybe you can tell me more about it.
Yeah, absolutely. The calmer the mind, the better your decision making, which is why I have to do it daily. I'm up at 4:30. I meditate at least for 45 minutes because it really impacts the quality of my day. On the days that I don't do it, I could be a nervous stranger.
I'm sure your spouse and your child will be very happy that you meditate.
Well, my child is happy. I don't know about my spouse, but I think it just puts you in the best position to be able to deal with whatever life throws at you, right? And in the life of business and markets, I think you are more bombarded with bad news and things going wrong rather than the highs. The highs happen, but they are periodic. But like you can be sure about coming across problems and having negative news to deal with. So then it just keeps you very balanced, and then you start being in a space of responding and not reacting to whatever is happening, which is what I find beautiful. But coming back to this blog post of yours, you had written, avoiding stupidity is far better than chasing genius, right? And I think that's where I want to go deeper into understanding what are the most common ways that you've seen people destroy their portfolios, since you were talking about the stupid mistakes that people end up making sometimes.
Oh, there are many ways people do that, but there are not very many. There are 3 or 4 ways in which people blow up their leverage is one common one. They end up using, markets can do it. They can be, if you don't borrow money, you can lose max 100% of your money. Stock can go to zero, but you can't be forced to sell if you don't have any. It can go down at 70%. You can't be forced to sell, but it will eventually bounce back. You don't have the capacity to hold if you have leverage in your portfolio. So people borrow money. Then the other thing which they do, these low trading costs have turned people into day traders. We have turned National Stock Exchange into the world's biggest casino. We have the highest large trading derivative exchange in the world. I don't think we need that. So and in fact, the founder of Zerodha a while back disclosed, because he has all the information with him, that at least on his platform, more than 90% of the day traders lose money, and of the remaining that do make money, most of them don't beat the fixed deposit rate of return. And
in fact, this was a SEBI published report also, that 93% of the traders actually lose money. So it's a published report in that sense.
That tells you about the overconfidence that exists out there in the world. Everybody thinks that they are in the 7%.
Yeah.
That can't mathematically.
Well, we all want to be the exceptions and the outliers and not the norm, right? But it's so hard to get yourselves to accept the fact that you might just be a part of the norm and not the exception, which is where, when you were talking about some of the companies that, when all the things are going wrong or there's a bad news cycle about a company, as a value investor, you would want that company to be the exception and, emerge out of this crisis and become more resilient. But how do you know that company is going to be an exception and not the norm? And you
don't know from advance. Investing is a game of probabilities. One of the most fundamental lessons that come from Ben Graham is that understand the role of uncertainty. Understand that no matter how well you do your work, you will go wrong. In fact, there was this talk that Roger Federer gave at Tuck School of Business. My daughter is studying there. He gave this beautiful talk. And he basically said that, I am one of the most, successful tennis champions. And, can you guess, look at the number of shots that I have played in my life. I have won only 54% of the shots. 54% of the points. He's lost 46% of the points. That means that even to be at the top of his game, he lost 46% of the points. So no matter how good you are, no matter how careful you are, investing is going to be a game of probabilities. you are going to be wrong some of the times. No matter how careful you are, bad luck is going to come. So you have to protect yourself from that. And the only way you can do that is by understanding that you will go wrong. There are two ways of dealing with it. One is, of course, you diversify. The other is to confront reality, to acknowledge that you have gone wrong and to not stay wrong. Being wrong is okay. Once you know that you are going to go wrong, if Roger Federer can be wrong 46% of the time, you're going to go wrong.
Absolutely.
Being wrong is okay, staying wrong is not okay. And investors make that mistake. They go wrong. They know deep down they have gone wrong. They bought it at 100, it's gone to 40. They keep waiting. When it goes back to 100, only then I will sell. It goes to 20. Policy. Yeah, all those, the anchoring, the sunk cost or the endowment effect, all those usual suspects come in. But deep down, they know they are wrong. Deep down, they know that they are wrong, but they will continue to stay wrong. And that's what destroys their portfolios. Part of the reason.
Yeah. And then, how do you go about identifying a company's true competitive advantage? Because, like you obviously want to find the exception to the norm and you want to back that outlier company. But when there are all these unfortunate news cycles, then you can start questioning the competitive advantage that you're betting on as well, right? So how do you know that the competitive advantage is going to be enduring and long?
You don't know. See, there is no such thing as no in the sense of physics, there's certainty about something. It's not physics, that the law of gravitation is going to work all the time. There are only probabilities. So how do you tilt the probabilities in your favor? There are some quantitative markers of a competitive advantage. There are some qualitative markers of competitive advantage. And this is how you frame your initial hypothesis. You're like a Bayesian. That there is the qualitative markers, that there is a high return on capital, there is there is a superior margin profile, there is a business which has gone from being fragile to becoming robust. They've gone from 1 plant to 5 plants, they've gone from 1 product to 10 products, they've gone from 1 vendor to 10 vendors, they've gone from one customer to 20 customers. They've gone, so basically in many ways they've gone from being very fragile to become more robust over time. So they become a better business over time. So they've gone from a company that raised money from capital markets to becoming a company that doesn't need any funding from outside capital market. They had leverage. They had not only had no leverage, they have excess liquidity on the balance sheet. So all these are quantitative markers of quality. So in the meantime, their returns on capital have become better and better over time. So these are all something that you could measure over time. This is a past trend that you have been monitoring, right? So that's just the quantitative. The next question is it going to last? And that's the most important one. A lot of people make mistakes. They look at the trend and they put an arrow at the end of the trend line without thinking that is it going to last? Because, these things sometimes do not last.
Yeah.
So that question becomes, why do customers buy these companies' product? Why don't they go to somebody else? What is the entry barrier? What stops somebody else, from, customer going to somebody else? Or what stops a competitor from coming into this company? And more importantly, in the world that we live in right now, threat from a different industry altogether. The app risk. In the world that we live in right now, who buys GPS devices anymore? You have them, on your phone. So in the world that we live in right now, a lot of the risk comes from a completely different industry. So the thing is, you have to keep thinking about what are the entry barriers, what can stop this company from remaining as profitable as it has been. So you have to keep obsessing over that. Again, these are all things that you have to keep like a Bayesian thinking about this all the time and respond to new information as it comes in. And then you have to think about the business, the quality of the management. What are the operating skills? How good they are in capital allocation? Are they doing anything about the integrity? What is the integrity of the management? And then the valuation bucket. So it's not rocket science, but it's at the end of the day, there is no certainty about these things. You are at the end looking for a reasonably good quality business, what you think will remain good quality business, which is run by honest and competent managers, and you have been able to buy them at what you think is is attractive valuation, but it's always subject to change.
Yeah.
If new information comes and regulatory changes happen, and I've experienced it. I've been invested in situations where a manager has done 21 transactions in the past and did wonderfully well in those transactions, and then he ended up buying things at ridiculous valuations that I wouldn't have wanted him to buy at all in the first place. So what do you do when that happens? Confront reality. Change your mind. In light
What
of,
did you do?
I had to change my mind. I think John Maynard Keynes said, "When facts change, I change my mind." What do you do, sir? You have to change. And I can confess, I've been too slow to change my mind in these things because there is so much of baggage. You have done so much of work on this company, on this entrepreneur, on this founder, and you have,
And you're emotionally invested.
you absolutely, you get so attached to these things, and it's easier to teach these things than to practice them in reality. Absolutely guilty as charged. But these things happen, and but you have to confront reality. And when you have disconfirming evidence coming in, you have to give adequate weightage to that, and then move on. And one trick that I use is to convert the losses into tuition fees, and say that I paid this tuition fees and I've learned an expensive lesson, and then forgive yourself and then move on. You can't just keep on mulling over this forever.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it, and appreciate the learning and the lesson in that investment. But this is also a good segue to ask you then, when is the time to sell? And what are some of the frameworks that one should lean on when deciding when to sell a stock? Because like we discussed, you could be emotionally invested in the company's growth and journey, or you could feel very passionately about it and not pay attention to some of the risks that emerged right along the way.
So you already pointed out what are the standard behavioral impediments involved in the sell decision. It's a very tough decision compared to the buy decision. So I'll give you the antidotes that I have come up with. So there are two big antidotes. One, don't think of the cost. Remove the cost column. You don't know what you paid for it, because a lot of people think, oh, it's gone up so much. I made so much money, so I have to sell. I want to cash out.
Yeah.
Or it's gone down so much, now I can't sell, that kind of a thing. So don't think of the cost. The second thing is reframe the sell decision into a switch decision to make yourself more objective. Instead of thinking, oh, it's gone up so much, should I sell? Or, it's become, or the P multiple has become so much. Have something to compare it with. So then it becomes more objective, that there is something else that you can replace it with, and that makes it easier. I'm not saying makes it completely simple, but it does make it a lot easier if you were to forget about the cost and to reframe the sell decision into a switch decision and force it to be compared with some other opportunity. So to find an opportunity outside the portfolio, or even inside the portfolio where you're not fully invested, and objectively compare it with what you already own. And you have to demonstrate that qualitatively this is what you don't own or what you under own is way better, and it's way cheaper. And then you have to ask yourself, why am I not switching?
Is it easy to practice in your personal experience?
It's easier to practice it this way than to just think of it sell as a isolated decision.
Which sector do you think is underappreciated today?
There's none. I don't look at it. I'm a bottoms-up stock investor, so I don't have any bias. There are sectors that I will not invest in because I don't understand them. But beyond that, I don't have any particular bias in favor or against. I'm only looking for underappreciated businesses. So again, like I said, I want to look for outstanding fundamental performance, which I understand, and I think there is a trajectory that I think is favorable, but it's being misappreciated by the markets. And when I see that combination, I don't care which sector they come from. So it doesn't matter to me.
So are there any sectors that particularly interest you in terms of, finding these outlier performances?
Yes.
Like which ones?
Bus, that's it.
No, but
I don't have any specific sector. I don't, right now, but to be honest, I'm not a buyer of a lot of things. Two spaces that I have invested in the recent past have been fossil fuels and financial stocks. Financial stocks, both in NBFC and banks, have been deeply out of favor, I think, for the wrong reasons, including in the micro lending space. I think Micro lending space is a cyclical business. Again, that's a feature, not a bug. There are cycles in that business. In a down cycle, some very strong companies are also thrown out like the baby with the bathwater or painted with the same brush.
Yeah.
So you get very strong companies which have gone through many cycles in the past and come out very strong eventually. Their stocks also drop 50-60%, and that gives you an opportunity. Obviously, the implicit assumption here is that history is a good guide over there, and only time will tell whether the assumption is correct or not.
Yeah, you're right about the financials being out of favor. I think over the last year, we saw this playing out. And then, all the banks came out with such strong earnings and they've actually performed quite well ever since. So, how did you identify, say, financials at that point where everyone was talking negatively about it? So, how.
I don't listen to what other people say. I just look at the numbers. I look at the numbers and I see the valuation. I look at the numbers. The numbers are wonderful. The businesses are doing fine. Again, one thing important in banking and basically lending businesses is that provisioning is not losses. As an accountant, what has happened is that if there's a delay in payment, the regulators require you to make a provision, and which is the correct accounting treatment, by the way.
Yeah.
And that takes an immediate hit on the P&L. But many times delays do not result in losses. There is a security that you has a hold as a collateral, and many times the payments come late. These things happen.
Yeah.
So not all delays result in loan losses. What we should worry about are loan losses. That's one point. Secondly, if your rate of interest is large enough to compensate you for loan losses, which is the case in micro lending operations, that's fine. You are lending to a risky segment, but the spread between the yield on the loans that you are giving and the cost of the money that you're borrowing is so large that you can absorb loan losses. So if you have even some loan losses, to be sure, there will be down cycles when those loan losses may look large. But if you have those loan losses compared to the spread that you have, you can absorb those losses.
Yeah.
Then you add the third factor that the capital adequacy ratios of these things are so good. Sometimes the debt equity ratios are 4:1 or some in that region, as compared to banks where it goes to 10:1.
Yeah.
You can absorb a lot of these losses. So if you look at the metrics, the numbers, again, as an accountant, I can tell you three or four things. They can handle this stress. The stress will come and go. It'll come and go. So the time to buy these things is when stress comes, because then everything goes on. And to be sure, the aggressive players are taken out of the game. So it's the same pari-mutuel thing going out. Many of the people in the micro lending business have been taken out. It's like a tsunami that comes. When the tsunami comes, the trees with the smallest roots get washed away. And that's the metaphor for the aggressive players in the lending business. They will be washed away. The strong players with deep roots, which means they have more capital adequacy, they have more capacity to suffer. They are more diversified asset books and so on and so forth. They have basically run their businesses very well. They will survive and they will thrive when the competition is reduced, when the industry turns. Moreover, their stocks also drop 30, 40, 50%. So that gives you the opportunity. And I love those kind of situations.
And as someone who might be watching, in their 20s and 30s, who might not be a trained accountant, if they hear on this podcast that, you need to look at, say, financials and the micro lending space, which are objectively the metrics that they should pay attention to even start their homework?
I would say drop everything, go and do a course in accounting. Today, you can learn anything by sitting at home. You can pick up a course in Coursera. You need 3 courses. Basically, you need 3 skills. You need accounting, you need to learn some economics, and you need to learn psychology. You need these 3 courses. You pick up these 3 courses and overlay experience. You don't need anything else.
Yeah.
So to say that, what are the metrics? I don't want, to spoon feed people. They can learn it. It's all learnable. It's so easy.
Yeah.
You don't have to go to college to do it either. You can just get it. It's all available now.
I'm so glad to hear you say that because, a lot of training in terms of becoming a good investor is also being able to do to be able to do your independent study and learning process, right? And that's what you have to be okay with if you want to get better at anything in life, but specifically investing.
Self-learning is the best learning. It
Yeah.
has to deep dive, and you have to keep the phone away.
Yeah.
You won't be able to learn if the phone is next to you.
Yeah.
You can't learn.
Absolutely. So when it comes to, you've taught some of India's brightest minds when it comes to investing. What are some of the common traits that you've seen in students who've gone on to become very good investors?
So I won't name names, but I have a student of mine who is now worth 60 crores. He had zero money when he came to me.
In how much time?
15 years.
Wow. Okay. That's amazing.
And he's extremely low profile. He's extremely humble, and he's a learning machine. And that's what I find, they're low profile, they're humble. And these are not just one example. There are a few other similar examples. I have a few of them. These are all learning machines, and they've all gone in their own ways. And I feel so proud about these people that I've been able to play some part over there in their lives. But it's just that they have incorporated some of the lessons that I've been able to teach them, which I also learned from my own role models over the years. And I've been able to, like a funnel, I've just distilled the wisdom that I've acquired from my own teachers and passed them on to my own students, and they are passing them on. Many of my students are doing internships. They are giving internships to their own students, so they pass it on. It's like paid forward. I love that concept of paying it forward. So it's wonderful to see that happen. It's absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, in fact, pay it forward is a very well entrenched concept in Silicon Valley. And that's how, that whole culture of, paying it forward and letting the next generation of entrepreneurs thrive and grow is how Silicon Valley has grown. And I think we are seeing the signs of that happening in India with, seasoned founders coming back to mentor younger founders. So it's a virtuous cycle that, eventually helps everyone in the...
The opposite of pay it forward, pun intended, is in venture capital. Ratcheting valuations.
That's true. But
Passing the parcel.
Passing the parcel. And if you were to go back to your younger self, are there any things that you would do differently? Say when you were 30 years old?
Why would I ever think of that? There's an opportunity cost associated with that. You only live life forwards, not backwards. So why would I even think about that? So I don't want to even go there. I'm not going to get that life back, right?
Yeah.
So it's not like you are, God who is going to give me that life back. I cannot turn the clock back. So there's no point. And I don't like the life of regret. I don't even want to go there and think, if only I could have done this differently. There's no point mulling over that. And there's an opportunity cost associated with that. Every moment spent on mulling over what could have been different is a moment that I would spend on something more meaningful, like something like this.
I'm glad you find this meaningful. That's a big win for the podcast. But, this actually even takes me back to Stoic philosophy, which we didn't dive very deep into. Tell me about your introduction to Stoic philosophy and how it's helped you in your investing.
It happened serendipitously, out of accidental discovery. So I became unwell, and I was having 107 fever, 106, 105 fever for quite a while, and I was just going through YouTube videos, and I came across this Swami Chimyananda's series on Bhagavad Gita. He's got every words of Gita explanation of that. So I went through all of that, and then I came across Stoic, and I came across Epictetus and Seneca and all of that.
Marcus Aurelius.
All of that. So I went through all of that. So I felt very glad that I became unwell, because when I came out of that, I was a totally transformed person. So my wife said, what has happened to you? Completely changed, transformed. I made some changes in my life, in my nutrition, in many things in my life after that. So it happened by accident, but during that period, I also reflected upon how I can incorporate these things that I have picked up, and I use them in my classes and those videos. Some of those Swami, I think Chimyananda is a great orator, and he's a wonderful communicator also. So so I incorporate them in my classes, in my own thinking.
Which concepts do you feel strongest about?
Well, but pretty much everything. He talks about impermanence, talks about flow of life. He talks about being detached. He talks about accepting reality. He talks about do your duty. I mean, the whole Gita is there for us to to study. I think you have to go through that. But it's wonderful, wonderful to to there's a concept called Lindy, which I'm sure you're aware of. That the longer a book has been in publication, the more it's likely to stay in publication. And the real reason behind it is that there's so much wisdom in there. And in the world that we live in right now, we can apply the ideas of these timeless books in our own contexts, and that's what we all end up doing. If we read them, we can apply them. So we talk about process and outcome, and if you study Mahabharata, that's what Krishna is telling Arjun, right? He says focus on your duty, dharma. Don't worry about the outcomes. It's the same thing. So yeah.
Yeah. So, and then when it comes to thinking about your legacy now, if you had to think, if you had to if you had to leave your children with just 3 books, what would those books be?
I'll leave them with my Kindle. It's got 1,400 books. Why would I leave them with only 3? They'll say, Papa, this is all that you left me with? 3 books?
Hopefully, there'll be a lot more of just barring just 3 books.
I got 2 for you, so they want to
Thank
say,
you for that. And I'm waiting for the book for my daughter.
Yeah, she has to be 8 years old to get that.
Yes. But what are some of the books that have had the most profound impact on you?
Well, many of them, but the books that I'll typically give to people who have an interest in value investing are basically I would recommend them to read The Letters of Warren Buffett, which I think is a essential one book which influenced me a lot, which is not talked about a lot by investors generally, is the book by Peter Lynch, One Up on Wall Street, which I think is very well written for a general audience.
Yeah.
For young people who want to understand a business and how it dissects different kinds of businesses, it was very well written. So I think that I would recommend. And then, of course, Philip Fisher on Common Stocks and Uncommon Profit. These are 3 books that I would definitely recommend.
Is there a business or investment decision you regret making?
No regrets ever.
No regrets.
If you have tranquility in life, there is a place for any regret. The goal is tranquility. It doesn't matter. I've seen people who have made hundreds and thousands of crores and they want more.
Yeah.
They're just into accumulation of wealth. And I know people who have tranquility on their face, and they have a roof on their head, and they have food in their belly, and they are healthy, and they don't have any debt, and they're happy. They don't need a lot of wealth to have tranquility. So it all depends on, of course, financial independence is important. Once you have financial independence and you have time on your hands and you have tranquility and you have good health, where is the space for any regrets?
Absolutely. But, this generation is also very misguided in the rat race and hustle culture and this hedonistic treadmill that just nothing is ever enough, right? You want thousands of crores and billions of dollars and, you want the fanciest of cars and the most luxurious apartment.
I thought the youngsters, they say we don't want to own anything, we don't want cars, we want to be, they're so hooked onto their phones, they don't want to drive. They want to sit in the back.
Yeah, but there's also this never-ending ambition, right? And there's also this generation that thinks that, you have to keep going after something or the other. And that's what hustle culture really is, that nothing is ever enough. And you were talking about tranquility, which is very different from what we experience in our daily lives. So how do we bridge the gap between the two? What is that parting thought that you would want to leave?
No, there's nothing wrong in the hustle culture. You have to... it's very easy for somebody who is turning 60 to talk about tranquility. But, when I was 25, I also wanted to, hustle and become financially independent. There's an age for everything. But money is important. There's no question about it. But the pursuit of money just for the sake of it becomes like a drug. Money is in that sense a drug. So once you recognize that, then you know when to stop. Uh, um, I think
When did
everybody
that
will
switch
find.
happen for you personally?
I don't want to impose my own judgment on anybody. Everybody has their own ambitions. It all about opportunity cost. When you realize that every moment that I'm spending on accumulating more wealth is a moment that I can't spend with my spouse, or a moment that I can't spend with my kids. There's a cost to that,
Yeah.
because that time is not going to come back,
Hmm.
and I can't take this with me. So then you start realizing, and it gets easier as you get older. So yeah, everybody will come to that judgment at some point in time in their lives.
And you're friends with a lot of people I've had the privilege to host on the show. What do you think is the most underrated skill in investing?
Peaceful mind,
Hmm.
silence.
Like Manish
Durgesh,
said,
you know Durgesh bhai?
yeah.
Huh?
No, I haven't.
Durgesh Shah, Flame University. He's part of the Flame ecosystem. He goes for Vipassana for 40 days,
Wow.
2-3 times in a year, and he's invested in markets. So he has the ability to go away for 40 days without a phone, without anything, for Vipassana, and come back. He
I
probably,
lasted 4 days.
yeah.
I lasted 4 days when I went for Vipassana.
Imagine he went, if he was gone, there was a war that happened and came back, and the war has happened and gone. Basically, the point is that there is a lot that can happen in the world which will have no bearing whatsoever on your portfolios virtually, if you only allow the power of compound interest to play out and don't interfere with it. And the way to do that is to detach from the world. And I'm not going to be able to do that. There are people in the Flame ecosystem who are way more evolved than I am in that space. And you met with one of them. Yeah.
Yeah, Manish actually even said on the podcast that capital markets are the way to nirvana, to achieving nirvana. Because, either you can go in the other direction like Ketan Parekh and all the Harshad Mehta stories, or you go in the complete opposite direction where you then start thinking about infinite games, playing for the long term and, abundance and a win-win mindset for everybody rather than, being like focused on the short term and quick wins and hustle and those sort of things.
No, those temptations are always there. You see, it's all again going back to spirituality. It's all about temptations. A lot of spiritual texts are about uh, avoiding temptations. Then the markets and always give you temptations to cut corners, temptations to break the law. There are in the world of financial markets, there are so many temptations. Get into insider trading, front running, pump and dump, and you only have to get caught once, and you go to zero. You end up in jail. It reminds me of that famous story that Buffett once said that if you give me a gun with has got 1,000 chambers in it, and there's only one bullet in one of the chambers, and you ask me how much money do you want to pull it, and I pointed to my head once, I'm not going to pull it. And people just do it. And you keep doing it, you're going to be right most of the time. We only have to get caught go wrong once. It's like, the game we were taught. Again, this is a lesson that we were taught in school. A low probability event, if you keep doing it, the probability that it has to happen only once is 100%. We were taught this in school, right? So if you keep doing crime, you can get away with crime 99% out of 100. And you feel good about it. Dopamine comes out and all that. You feel very good about it. But nobody does it only once. Then you go back and do it again and again and again, and you only get caught once.
After decades of investing, what are some financial myths that you think people should stop believing now?
Oh, one big financial myth I think people should stop believing. Actually, I hope they don't stop believing. Is the indexing is the magic wand out there, because the indexing revolution has become so big that as the world moves more and more towards passive investing, active investors will get a competitive advantage. Companies that are thrown out of the index will get derated for all the wrong reasons. I love that.
Yeah.
So anytime a business gets derated for non-value reasons, that's an opportunity. And for again, people are not realizing that if more and more part of the market becomes index, then who are you going to sell to? When the times go, when the markets are going up, the indexes are going up. More and more money is going into index stocks and index funds, and all that is going fine. And many of the small cap indices and mid cap indices are going. The money is going into not very liquid stocks. When there's a bear market or a severe bear market, and we're going to have one, are we going to have one? For sure.
Yeah.
When that happens, when they have to sell those shares, there is no exit. Then investors who think that they are safe, they will realize that well, it's not. People have not. I was reading yesterday how much money people have lost in treasury ETFs in the US because yields have gone up.
Yeah.
They've lost 30, 40, 50% of their money. So this whole concept that this is safe because it has done well in the past, so it will always be safe, is a myth.
Yeah. And in one sense, a lot of equity investors in the Indian market today, this is pretty much their first cycle because a lot of them came to the market post the pandemic and, they were like, this is where the money should be parked, etc. And we've seen that happen in terms of, SIP inflows that are happening in the country have pretty much 4 or 5x. So how does one prepare for financial crisis like that?
It's
right?
good. I'll use the pun.
Yeah.
When you're learning how to cycle, you have to fall off the cycle a few times to learn how to cycle very well.
Yeah, tell us about the time where you've lived through enough market cycles.
I fell off the cycle many times.
So what was that experience like? Going back to crisis.
I got my bruises. I've talked about them in many of my classes and lectures.
Let's talk about some bruises.
The money life. I've given talks in Suchita Dalal. She called me a few times, and I talked about them. So yeah, I've used to borrow money. I've played with derivatives. I've done activism. I've done all kinds of nonsensical things which I will not do now. Dumb things, and maybe the things that I'm doing right now, I will think of them as dumb when I'm 70. So yeah, those things happen. But absolutely, you can't have a useful career in investing unless you have made mistakes and got bruised. Absolutely. You can't learn how to invest by only watching other investors. You have to do it by yourself. You have to go wrong. You have to fall down. You have to get up and put bandages on your bruises and play again.
And find the resilience to keep going.
Absolutely. No, the cycle metaphor is important because you can't, you have to, you will fall down. You will make mistakes. So just because people are young, this is the first cycle, it's good. Let them. Actually, I always tell my students when they say, "Sir, please bless me," I say, "I bless you with initial losses," because that will make you conservative. When you lose money in your initial years, that is what will teach you the meaning of permanent loss of capital. That will make you more conservative.
Yeah.
Because if you make easy money makes you think that you're a master of the universe. It makes you overconfident, and that's not going to be good for you in the long run.
I think that's what happened, like 30-40% IRRs in people's personal portfolios in the last 2-3 years, and suddenly they gave you correct.
Mean reversion will come.
Yeah, like you were saying. But yeah, I think, it's good to know these facts going in, right? But so how does one navigate those times where like a crisis is hit? Then what should your mental model be at that point?
Don't borrow money. Live frugally. If you do well in a few years, think of amortize it over the next few years. Don't think this, abhi to party shuru hui hai. Don't extrapolate it that, now I don't have to work, I can retire. And, it's very natural.
Don't come up with random fire numbers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, think that you got lucky, you are blessed and all that. And, what you earn in the last one year or is on money that you would earn over the next 3 or 4 years. And then there is pain coming. So once you incorporate that in your thinking, you will not go out and buy a camellias. You will buy a 2-bedroom apartment in some colony, or maybe take a house on rent. So you will not overextend. So don't overextend and don't borrow.
And speaking from your mistakes.
Yeah. No, I didn't make those mistakes, but I made other stupid mistakes. Many stupid mistakes. FNO, loan against shares, a whole hostile takeovers and all kind of.
Let's talk about loan against shares and FNO because that's caught the attention of a lot of people in their 20s and 30s where they do have the overconfidence to be able to believe that they will be the exception again, right?
Yeah.
And clearly you also lived through that cycle. I have never been into FNOs, so I'm not an active. I don't have any active experience there, but would love to learn from your experience.
So in 2003-4, I think around that time, I used to get again hyper overconfident and would borrow money and wanted to get rich faster. I got poorer faster because of that. So all kinds of crazy things happened. Elections and India. Bad election, I mean, unexpected election result in the market shutdowns, big shutdown of markets and margin calls. And, basically, you realize that you don't have the capacity. And all those stocks went back. It's not like I was not buying good businesses. I was buying good businesses at good prices, but I didn't have the capacity to stay invested in those things because I had borrowed money. So there was a margin call and I didn't have the liquidity to pay for the margin call. So the broker would sell my shares.
Yeah.
I was forced seller in a down market. So, and after 4 days, the stock went up way above the price and it was taken away from me. So that teaches you that, you have an asset liability mismatch. You have a short-term liability and you financed it with a long-term asset. It's what brought down LTCM. It's what brought down so many other businesses. You learn about that later on, much later on.
Yeah. Professor, you often cite the work of Daniel Kahneman and also talk about behavioral finance a lot in your teachings. What's a personal bias that you have personally struggled with?
Well, when I do a post-mortem of decisions that I was clearly wrong on, I have found that the corrective action that I took, I was too slow to have taken the corrective action. And again, the reasons are behavioral. There's always the commitment bias, falling in love with the ideas, going into denial mode, and there's always noise. There's information coming in. You want to give them more leeway. There's some information about the performance of the business. The moat is getting eroded. There's a governance issue. You might think this is the one-off thing. Don't think too much about it. But I should have been more brutal about it, and I should have been more objective about it. Absolutely. I did take the right decision eventually, but I should have been quicker about it. So in the sense that, as I said earlier, that the market is a Bayesian, no doubt about it. The market will come to the right conclusion in the long run, but it takes too long. Even I would like to be a Bayesian, but the way Thomas Bayes would have liked it to be. So he actually tells you that there is a process, but in some cases you should change your mind very, very quickly. So he gives an example. So again, it gets a little technical, so we'll leave the technicalities, but there is a process that he tells you that in some situations you change your mind very, very quickly. In some cases you change your mind very slowly. So I found that there have been certain developments in some situations where I was holding on to a situation where I should have exited very, very quickly, but I did not. I took time to do that. Maybe a few quarters. I should have done it maybe in a few days. So that's the mistake that I need to work more on.
Has it changed now?
It is. It's definitely got better, but there is still scope for improvement. There's always be some scope for, and to be sure, there will be new ways of making more mistakes.
Yeah.
And there's no such thing as a perfect, rational investor, I think.
That's what makes life a fun ride also.
Yeah.
But, just final thoughts before we wrap up.
Yeah.
There's a lot of bullishness about the India opportunity at large, right? Like we are going to conquer and, third largest economy, etc. And, we are on track to do that. But what is your zoomed out version of what India will look like 15, 20 years from now?
Right now, I'm more interested in conquering Pakistan. Let's get over with that one first, because it's a big threat we have. focusing on the imminent threat is more important because it's a serious threat. It's not a small threat. This geopolitical risk is not a small risk.
Yeah.
Because if you really think about it from a from a risk to India, this is not a small risk. It's a low probability risk, but the consequences of the worst case scenario are devastating. I'm not saying that the risk will happen. I hope it never happens, but it's something that we need to deal with.
Yeah.
So if there's anything that can hurt India's long-term story in the long run, we are dealing with it right now. So let's not trivialize it. It's not an insignificant risk. What's happening in our neighboring country is not something that we should think of it as a 2-day thing or a 1-day thing. It's not something trivial. We should be very concerned about what is happening over there, and not just over there, but we have troublesome neighbors.
Yeah.
So this geopolitical risk about India is not a small thing.
Yeah, that's true. And there's so much polarity across the world, right? And so many wars going on, a lot of geopolitical tension. And then there's the US president who thinks he can tell us how to run our own country in some way.
I love your optimism. So I'm glad that I met you. I feel like a Bayesian. I'm adapting my pessimism a little bit.
I'm pointing out real risks.
I'm meta updating my views and I'm becoming a little more optimistic about this whole thing. Yeah, but you're right. There is no stopping India if we can deal with this risk in a meaningful way. If we take away with this risk, if we can deal with this risk effectively, this geopolitical risk, I think this is the best place to be in.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for taking out the time to do this with me today. I know you don't do this very often, so it means so much more just from that perspective. And this was a really important conversation to get out there because, it will inspire and trickle, hopefully, different parts of the brain for the audience watching where, psychology, accounting, spirituality, Stoic philosophy, and value investing and behavioral finance, obviously. I think there were elements, so many beautiful elements through the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you for doing
it. Thank you so much. Thank you.
It's not every day that you get to sit across from your icon and ask them all the questions that you wanted answers to. And that was the day for me today. If you enjoyed watching this episode, please remember to subscribe to our channel so that you get notifications every time we drop another one.